Hello, everyone. Professor Cornish here. Welcome to our presentation on risk and protective factors and criminogenic needs and risks. Now, it's important that we understand what risk and protective factors are because a lot of the criminological theories, whether they're pure criminological, sociological, psychological, human development, education, etc., they look at these risk factors. These risk factors are actually what the theory is targeting, as well as the various programs that are used in the criminal justice system and the related fields. They target these factors. So it's important that you understand what they are. Now, first, we're going to look at risk factors. Now, risk factors are characteristics present in an individual that, in the case of criminal offending, increases the likelihood that he or she will offend or reoffend. Basically, risk factors, they're just things that are present that increase the likelihood. Just like some of you might have heard risk factors for heart disease or stroke or cancer or things like that. They're not guarantees, but they increase the likelihood that something will occur. And with the criminal justice field, with risk factors, we're looking at things that will increase the likelihood someone will criminally offend or reoffend. Now, the true impact of a risk factor, it's dependent on their significance, their importance, and also the developmental state of the individual and the presence of other risk factors. Now, as we go into the presentation, some of you probably are going to have some risk factors. But the more risk factors you have, especially when they're significant, the greater the likelihood that someone will criminally offend or reoffend. Again, it's not a guarantee because you will find individuals that do have a lot of risk factors that they don't commit crimes. Now, an individual is 10 times more likely to commit a violent act if 2 or more risk factors are present. Again, not a guarantee, just increases the odds. Now, there's different risk factors at different levels. Now, at the individual level, what the person has themselves, the first risk factor is presence of a mental disorder, a mental illness, like oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder, impulse control disorder, schizophrenia, etc. Now, again, mental illness being a risk factor is not a guarantee that someone's going to commit crime. Now, the reason why mental illness is considered a risk factor is because the symptoms of some mental illnesses are risk factors in and of themselves. Like, for example, if someone has impulse control disorder, they have a diminished ability to control impulses. So they act without thinking. So that person's going to engage in riskier behavior. They may end up committing crime just because they're thinking things through. So again, mental illness, not a guarantee, but some of the symptoms of some mental illnesses are risk factors in and of themselves. Also, there can be abnormalities in brain structure, hormones, or neurotransmitters. Other risk factors at the individual level include restlessness, difficulty concentrating, risk-taking, impulsive behavior, low self-control. This is partly why juveniles we'll see them start committing status offenses and delinquent acts, is the human brain doesn't fully develop until around the age of 25, especially the prefrontal cortex, which is behind your forehead. That is in charge of a lot of executive, higher functioning brain functions, to include rational thought, thinking things through, doing that cost benefit analysis. Hey, is this actually good, or am I going to get in trouble doing this? It's also controls impulse control, regulating emotions, and future thinking. Not just focused on the here and now, but okay, if I do this, how could it affect me a month from now, 6 months, a year, 5 years? So that's why juveniles do have a lot of status offenses and delinquent offenses, is their brain's not fully mature yet. So they don't have that impulse control, that rational thought that's needed. Other risk factors: antisocial behavior, attitudes or beliefs, inadequate development of coping mechanisms, aggression, hyperactivity, problem behavior, dishonesty, low tolerance to frustration and stress. Also, being, physical violence, identifying with deviant individuals, other people that are getting in trouble committing crime, lack of attachments to conventional institutions and individuals, people that aren't getting into crime, they're pro-social, they're law-abiding, they don't get in trouble, involved in activities that they're not going to get in trouble in. Also, if they're involved in criminal activity, obviously, lack of empathy, lack of guilt and remorse, etc. And there's more individual level risk factors. So these are the things the individual has in and of themselves. Now, the next level is family. Now, one risk factor is low socioeconomic status. The reason why poverty is considered a risk factor is oftentimes there are other risk factors that come into play. Like, for example, let's say you have a single parent who, to make ends meet, they're working 2 jobs. Obviously, there's probably going to be some older children that aren't going to be monitored because that parent's working. So with poverty, you have other risk factors that are coming into play that can increase the likelihood. Just like mental illness, it's not, oh, well, you're mentally ill or you're poor, you're going to be committing crime. It's the fact that there are other risk factors that can come into play that can increase the odds. Not a guarantee again. Other risks at the family level: antisocial parents or family, criminal behavior, or gang involvement. So if you have parents or other family members that are committing crimes, they're engaging in antisocial behavior, they're in gangs, etc. If you look at social learning theory, we learn through observation. So if you are growing up around family members that are committing crimes, you're more likely to learn that it's okay. Also, if there's the presence of substance abuse and or mental illness in the home, again, not a guarantee. It's just you're going to have additional risk factors coming into play. Poor parent-child relationships, discipline that is either harsh or laxed. So it's basically you're having parental discipline that's on the extremes. That's what comes into being risk factors. Also, if there's abuse or neglect going on in the home, presence of other violence in the home, family conflict, separation of parents, weak family structure, lack of supervision and monitoring, large family size. Now, again, that's just because you can have some other risk factors that are coming into play potentially. Poverty, condoning of violence in and out of the home, low parental involvement, etc. Now, one individual risk factor I want to go back to, being male is considered a risk factor. And the reason why it is the condoning of violence. Now, granted, things are getting better, but it used to be where boys, you couldn't show your emotions, you couldn't be sad, you couldn't cry or anything. You had to be tough. You had to be a man. If you got into a fight, it was, oh, well, good job, way to go. Boys will be boys, things like that. So that's why being male is a risk factor. It's the fact that, now granted, things are kind of changing around with that, but you would end up having the condoning of deviant behavior because, oh, well, they're a boy. Now, again, these risk factors are not guarantees. It's just increasing the likelihoods. Now, at the peer level, some of the risk factors, now again, all the risk and protective factors we're going to be going over in this presentation, it is not a complete list. I mean, there's many, many more. I'm just going over some of the common ones. Now, with peers, they can be friends, they can also be people that are around the same age. You have weak social ties and attachments. Peers that are antisocial, they are engaged in delinquency, they might be involved in gangs, they might commit criminal activity. Also, if your peers are accepting of antisocial behavior, because basically they're going to be reinforcing you getting into trouble and not reinforcing you doing good, acting the way you're supposed to. Now, with peers, I do need to know significance is coming into play. Because if it's just someone in your class that's deviant that you're not friends with, that's not going to do anything. But if it's like your best friend, that's a more significant relationship. The same thing with family. If it's like an aunt that's deviant that you're not close to, really isn't going to matter. It's not going to have an effect on a juvenile. But if it's like an aunt that you're super tight with, that's a significant relationship, and that is going to increase the likelihood. Now, there's also risk factors at school. I do need to note that I geared this presentation towards juveniles, but for adults, you could have also risk factors related to work as well. But again, I'm gearing this more towards juveniles. Now, risk factors related to school, you've got a poor attitude towards school. Not performing well, you're failing, high rate of truancy, not going to class, skipping class, not going to school, dropping out, expulsion. a lot of these, you've got additional risk factors that'll end up coming in to play, like not having anything constructive to keep your time on. Later in life, not being able to get, a decent paying job, things like that. Poor school climate, a disparity in student to staff ratio. With that, it's one, if you've got a ton of kids in a classroom, it's harder to teach and get them to learn, as well as since everybody learns a different way at a different rate, the more students you have in a class, the harder it is to make sure all of them are learning and teaching in a way that each student is going to be able to get it. Larger class sizes, you'll start having students that maybe learn a bit slower, or their learning style is different from the teacher's teaching style. They have a greater likelihood of starting to fall behind. And then also with just staff in general, you could have things going on in the school like bullying and vandalism and other crimes going on, a student skipping class and just all this. And it's going to be less noticed because you don't have enough staff. Also, if there's violence going on in the school, if a juvenile, another set of risk factors, if a juvenile doesn't have any connection to school, they're not involved in school. And there's also neighborhood risk factors. There's crime in the neighborhood, especially if it's a high crime rate. There's drugs and or gangs, high availability of drugs and weapons, neighborhood disorganization, residents not feeling safe in the community. With that, you're not going to have people like, being outside of their homes, neighbors, doing things together, talking to each other. You're going to be less likely to have, residents out kind of supervising the kids when they're like out playing. When I was a child, I used to go over to my cousin's place, and they lived in a trailer court. And we had a big group of us. I was the only child that wasn't there from the trailer court because I lived elsewhere. But there was a big group of kids from the trailer court, to include my cousins. We all played together. And we mainly played in like the central row of the trailers. All the residents there were looking out for us kids. And if one of us did something stupid, believe me, parents got called right away. But they were also looking out for us, making sure we were safe. And if you have a neighborhood that, residents don't feel safe, there's a lot of crime and gangs and drugs, that starts going down. Also, other risk factors, no organized activities for juveniles. For juveniles, the highest crime times after school on weekdays. The reason why is you get a bunch of juveniles together and they're not monitored. That's why it's important to have things for them to do after school. Is if they're not monitored, like let's say parents are working, or the juvenile went over to a friend's house and there's nobody monitoring, or they just went, hey, we're going to go ride bikes. If there's nothing for the kids to do, what do they end up doing? They get bored, and a lot of times they end up doing stupid things, and some of them end up being crimes. Also with the neighborhood, if there's lack of social supports, community pride, low level of neighborhood attachments, etc. Now, the bad thing is some of the most impoverished neighborhoods that do need support, like social services and businesses that have jobs and whatnot, the areas that need it the most don't have those things. So it ends up kind of making the problem worse and causes this cycle over and over. Now that we've gone over the different levels of risk factors, there are two different types of risk factors. Now, the first are criminogenic needs. Now, these are dynamic risk factors, meaning that they can change through intervention, a change in circumstances. Like, let's say, for example, you had a juvenile that parents, substance users, this juvenile's the oldest sibling, they're having to take care of their younger siblings, and they're stealing from stores so they can feed their brothers and sisters. Let's say the group of siblings, they end up going into foster care, and now they're well taken care of, and this older sibling doesn't have to commit crime to try to feed and clothe their little brothers and sisters. That's a change in circumstance. Most likely, they're not going to be doing that stuff anymore because, hey, we're all in a safe environment now. I don't have to be the parent and try to figure things out. Also, the passing of time. The majority of juveniles that do engage in delinquency do age out of it. It's mainly because, one, they're gaining life experience. As they age, they're gaining wisdom. They start forming a stronger sense of self, who they are. They're not as influenced by external sources like, family and peers. And also, as you age, your prefrontal cortex starts maturing. And when I worked in the correctional system, I supervised some inmates 18, 19, getting into all kinds of trouble in the facility. But I worked for my one department long enough where I did see some of those inmates start aging out because their brains did mature. They started gaining more wisdom and life experience. So criminogenic needs are risk factors that can change. Examples include risk-taking, inadequate development of coping mechanisms, impulsive behavior, antisocial behavior. Now, substance use, I will say it and mental illness are in a fuzzy gray area, and I will talk about both in a little bit. So just remember, criminogenic needs, they can change. With programming, you're mainly targeting the criminogenic needs. Now, the next type of risk factor is criminogenic risks. Now, these are static, meaning they don't change. But the adverse effects of them can. Like, for example, we'll look at one family risk factor, abuse and neglect. We can't change the fact that a juvenile was a victim of child abuse, but we can change the adverse effects of that child abuse. Like get them into a more stable environment where that's not occurring, whether it's either a foster home or working with their parents, helping them learn better parenting techniques where they're not abusing their children. Helping them learn that, abuse is not the way that you're supposed to deal with things. This is appropriate behavior. Child abuse, even though it's static, as I said, we can change the adverse effects. Also, if a person has a criminal history, we can erase the fact that someone committed crimes in the past. But through programming and other interventions, we can change the adverse effects of that criminal history to some degree. Academic failure in school, etc. Now, again, while they can't be changed, their adverse effects can be reduced, and in some cases eliminated. Now, mental illness and substance use are actually fuzzy gray areas where they're kind of both. Like with substance use, someone can stop using any substance that they're addicted to. But it's static because that addiction's always going to be there. But you can change the effects through programming, learning situations that were triggering to them, why they were using, developing better coping mechanisms for, okay, if I use when I'm depressed, what are better things I can do to help myself when I'm depressed? Just like with mental illness, someone is always, for some mental illnesses, they're permanent. You can't change the fact that someone has it, but you can stabilize them through medication if it's appropriate. You can provide therapy that will help with it. So even though it's static, you could still change it. Now, we're going to talk about, as far as criminogenic needs and risks, the big 4 and the big 8. Now, for those of you that are studying criminal justice or you're in the field right now, you've probably heard of the big 4. This is what programs in the criminal justice field, especially ones that are for rehabilitation, are targeting. This is the big 4. Your antisocial cognitions or criminalistic attitudes, antisocial personality patterns, antisocial criminalistic peers and associations, and criminal history. Now remember, criminogenic need, you can change it. Now the thing is, you're probably going, wait a minute, I thought criminal history was static. It is. So you've got really the big 3 that are criminogenic needs or dynamic, and then you've got the criminogenic risk and criminal history. Because if you have someone, the more crimes you've committed in the past, the harder rehabilitation is. That's why it's in the big 4. It doesn't make rehabilitation impossible, it's just a little tougher. So the big 4 are what, with rehabilitative programming, what they're going after. But then you also have the rest that they'll also look at too. So once they start addressing the big 4, they'll also look at, okay, education and employment. So if someone doesn't have a high school diploma or GED, let's get them one. That's why correctional facilities a lot of departments mandate you get a high school diploma or GED, that you participate in those. Well, that's part of the reason why, like, for example, if you're on probation or parole, you're required to get a job. Is with education and employment, once you start working towards those, it's going to start knocking out some risk factors that are associated. Also, other parts of the big 8, you've got family and marital circumstances, so things going on in the home. Also, leisure and recreational activities, and this is big for juveniles. How do you make up your time? What do you do? So if you have a juvenile that their free time, they're going and just getting into trouble, let's get this juvenile involved in something better, like maybe a sport or like an after school club, or hey, this juvenile's interested in comic books. There's a class once a week that's done at this art studio on how to draw anime. Also, other criminogenic risks that are in the big 8 that are targeted: substance use, to include abuse and dependence. All of those additionally predict criminal behavior, and they are going to be targeted through programming. So these are the ones that they look at for programming. So in the correctional field, when they do initial classification, whether it's in a correctional facility or probation, parole, other community-based corrections, this is what they're going to be looking at when they start doing classification and doing the assessments. Is they're going to be identifying what all the risk factors are and start kind of coming up with a plan of how are we going to target these. And also, during the initial classification process, they're also going to be looking at risk factors. Now, I do need to note that risk factors and also protective factors, because we're about to go into them, they also are examined in prevention programs, intervention programs, rehabilitative programs, reintegrative programs. So you've got programs across the field that we're looking at these. Now, just to go back to that previous slide, you can pretty much from this slide tell what protective factors are. If the risk factors are basically the ball, that wrecking ball, the protective factors are the buffer. They're the umbrella. They are the protection. Some of you may know a juvenile that has a ton of risk factors that we've talked about, but yet they're not getting into trouble. And you may look at this juvenile and go, how in the heck are they not committing crimes? How are they okay? The answer is protective factors. And also the fact that the risk factors aren't significant. Now, protective factors, they serve as a buffer between the presence of risk factors and the onset of criminality. They're the umbrella to that wrecking ball. If any of you are involved, like in wrestling, for example, they're the floor mat that help protect you from the hard floor. Protective factors minimize the adverse effect of the risk factors, thus reducing the likelihood you're going to commit crime, reducing the incidence of problem behavior. Now, the greater the significance of the protective factor, the greater its cancellation ability is. So you can have this kid that has all of these risk factors and maybe not many protective factors, but the protective factors are significant and they'll cancel out the risk factors. I mean, it's absolutely amazing. And it doesn't take a lot of risk factors at times, a lot of protective factors at times to cancel out the risk factors, even if they're greater numbers. A lot of it is the significance of the risk factors compared to the protective factors. It's kind of like you have a bunch of chickens compared to one elephant. The chickens being the risk factors. You may have 100 chickens, but that one big elephant outweighs those 100 chickens. That's what it's like with protective factors. It doesn't take many, but if they have a great significance, and the risk factors, even though there are many, don't have a great significance, that's where the cancellation comes in. Now, some protective factors at the individual level, you yourself are intolerant towards deviance. Like, hey, I don't want to do that. It's not my thing. You perceive sanctions for transgressions. Like, hey, I don't want to do drugs because I'm on the basketball team. And if we get a random drug test, I could get kicked off the team. You have a positive social orientation. You identify and are attached with conventional individual associations and institutions. So, like, you've got friends that aren't getting into trouble. You've got activities you're involved in where you're not getting into trouble. And it doesn't have to be anything big. Like, it could be, hey, I like riding horses. Or I like drawing. Something constructive that isn't antisocial, criminalistic law breaking. Also, high IQ, being female. This is because, now granted, things are changing, but it used to be being female children often got more social control than what males did, where male boys would get the, boys will be boys, that they're just being boys, they're just roughhouse. That same behavior in girls would get stopped. Now, again, that is changing. Another big individual protective factor, strong sense of self-esteem and self-image. You are sure of yourself, because with that, it's going to reduce any outside influence. You feeling that you have to impress people, or people calling you a nerd or whatever, or hey, come on and smoke a joint, come on, go hang out with us. Family protective factors. You've got warm, supportive relationships. The family's looking out for each other. You're checking in. No criminal activity. No violence, no substance use, no mental illness in the home. Now, I do need to note that, again, with like the substance use and the mental illness, a lot of it's due to the fact that you've got other risk factors that are coming in. So even though, you might have like mental illness in the home, but let's say it's under control. Any risk factors that were from symptoms or anything else attached with it, it's under control. Parents or caregivers are appropriately using discipline, not too harsh, not too lax, just right. The Goldilocks zone. The kids are getting monitored and supervised. You know, they're not able to just go run amok. As far as peers are engaging in conventional pro-social behavior. They're attached to conventional individuals and institutions. They're not tolerant to delinquent behavior. They exhibit pro-social behavior, etc. Now, you might have, like, let's say you've got one juvenile you're friends with. Yeah, they might get into trouble, but let's say they're going, hey, man, you know, you don't want to do what I do. You know, I'm getting in trouble all the time. I'm on probation. That juvenile, even though they're getting into trouble, they would be a protective factor because they're saying, hey, yeah, I was getting into trouble and I'm on probation. You don't want to be on probation. It stinks. As far as school, the juvenile themselves is committed to school. They're involved in activities, and it doesn't have to be like sports and whatnot. But the thing is, they have something that occupies their time. Like, you know, I work campus security right now. I've got students that are in all kinds of things. Clubs, sports, some like to draw, some write, some play music, some draw. Just something that bides their time that's important to them. That's what this is. Also, they have academic achievement. They graduate. Because graduating is going to eliminate a lot of risk factors. Attending college or vocational training. Schools have low student to staff ratio because, again, the teachers, they're going to be able to better teach to all the students. If a student is falling behind, it's going to get caught quicker. There's going to be more staff to make sure that there isn't trouble going on in the school. Also, staff caring, because they could end up being a huge protective factor, you know, turning into a role model. You know, you may have a kid that's got all kinds of stuff going on at home, but at school they've got, you know, like the custodian and a couple of teachers and a coach that really cares about them, that makes sure they're doing okay, that checks on them. They would be huge protective factors. And in the school, there's either no or low violence, etc. Now, as far as the neighborhood, low or no crime present, absence of gangs, things for the youth to do, commitment and support in prevention and intervention programs, community pride, employment opportunities, and also strong social supports. You know, it makes a huge difference. Now, again, with the risk factors, they just increase the likelihood. They are not a guarantee. And granted, the more risk factors you have, the more likely someone is to commit crime. But then you also have to look at the significance as well. You know, what is the significance to that person? The protective factors are what buffer the risk factors. They're what keep you out of trouble. They decrease the likelihood. And you don't have to have many, but if they're significant, they can have a huge canceling effect. Again, this is why if you see this kid in the most horrendous of circumstances, and you wonder, why in the heck is this kid not getting into trouble? It's because even though they have a lot of risk factors, they're not significant. And they have enough protective factors that are significant that it's canceling it out. Now, I hope you all enjoyed the presentation. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, please reach out to me. Also, if there's anything that you would like me to cover. Now, just remember with these risk and protective factors, these are what various programs are going after, whether they're prevention programs, intervention, rehabilitation, reintegrative. Also, risk and protective factors, when you look at the various theories that are in criminology, you could start looking at, oh yeah, well, this theory is addressing this, this, and this risk factor, and this, and this protective factor. Now, I will have other presentations on programming, as well as other presentations on criminological theories. So if you want to start seeing how these risks and protective factors start coming into play, feel free to watch those. Again, I hope you all enjoyed it. Have a good rest of your day and stay safe out there.